Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. John Green, to talk about Alessandro Fersen. Thank you for joining us today.
Absolute pleasure.
Dr. Green is a professor of theater at Columbia College in Chicago, and you've recently written a book about Alessandro Fersen. Why don't we start by you telling me how you got interested in Alessandro in the first place?
I was interested in ritual and theatre. This is at a time when I was living in England. And I came across an article in a New York publication, very short article, interview with Fersen. And it sounded fascinating. And at the end of the article, 2 books were mentioned in English. And I thought, great, I'll get hold of these 2 books and read up on him. The books were not available. And I discovered later they weren't even translated into English. So once I'd received this information, I managed to get hold of his address in Rome. So I wrote to him and basically said, I'm fascinated by your interview. I've never heard of you. Why haven't I heard of you?
Now, he's a celebrity at this point,
He's a
right?
celebrity. And he wrote back and said, well, come and see me. And I'm delighted that you're interested in my work. So I did. And I spent 3 or 4 weeks with him in Rome in a first visit. So,
and when you say with him,
you
shadowed him?
I shadowed him. He took me into his studio. I saw his students. I talked to his students. He basically, because he was an incredibly generous man, threw everything open to me and said, look, here's my work. It needs translating. And we would meet every day and talk. And then I'd go into the studio, as I said, see his work. And he gave me access to his students to talk to his students and his colleagues. And subsequently, we would meet periodically after that. Eventually, I was able to invite him to a conference in Wales, in Cardiff. And he went to an international conference there. And we continued to communicate with each other almost up until the time of his death in 2001.
And at what point in his career did you intersect him?
I intersected with him in the early, mid-1990s. So he's pretty much at the end of what he would call the experimental phase of his career. He's no longer working in the studio trying to discover new things. He's really cementing his legacy and doing a lot of research and writing.
And for those who aren't familiar with him, his legacy in a few words.
He is one of the post-Second World War, 1950s theater experimentalists. He's one of the theater makers who deliberately sets out to discover new things about acting, and in the process sets up his own studio. And because he does this in around about 1956, he has people like Grotowski, Peter Brook, the Living Theatre, they all come and visit him. So he's part of that nexus of theatre makers whose work takes us through the 70s and 80s. And we could say in theatre, their work still reverberates into, there's not a theatre program in the country that doesn't teach some version of Brook's work or Grotowski's work. And he's right at the start of that.
Now, one of the things that's unique about his experimenting is that he was interested in primitivism and ritual. Can we talk a little bit about
Certainly.
that?
He, just to give you some more context of him, he was actually born in Poland in 1911, and then of a Jewish family. And then his parents decided to move to Italy with the expectation that when he grew up, he'd become a lawyer or a banker within the family tradition. And he didn't do that. He went to university, and he discovers at university anthropology. And but he's not studying anthropology. He's actually studying literature and poetry.
So he starts out with his interest in anthropology and then goes to theater.
Then goes to theater.
That's interesting.
He doesn't go to theater for a long time. Eventually, with the rise of Mussolini in Italy, he finds his position there almost untenable. He gets into trouble when he's doing his doctoral dissertation in the university because he because of his interest in anthropology, he gets interested in play and the origins of play, and wants to get back to. He basically says, following Nietzsche, why is Western industrial society in such a state? Because we've lost that pre-industrial sense of community.
Yeah, Toonies, of course, too.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
And that's complete anathema to the authorities in Italy. And he eventually...
Under Mussolini at this point,
Under Mussolini,
right? Yeah.
where his thesis advisor is actually jailed for his opinions and has to be got out of jail in order so that Alessandro can complete his dissertation. Anyway, he gets his degree and leaves immediately and goes to Paris. And in Paris, he starts to hang out. He's doing day jobs to make money. He starts to hang out on the fringes of the Paris intelligentsia. He's on the verges of surrealism.
Everything's fringe in Paris.
Everything's fringe in Paris at this point.
Go ahead. Yeah.
He just misses meeting Antonin Artaud, but he meets Charles Dullin, who is a foremost theatre practitioner in Paris at the time. And Dullin is interested in anthropology. And Dullin is doing mask work, exploring a lot of ritual. And Dullin says to Alessandro, well, you should be going to the university here, the University of Paris, and you should be studying under Lévi-Brul. And so he does. He manages to scrape together money to take classes in anthropology. Then the war breaks out, and he can't go back to Italy. If he goes back to Italy, he'll be conscripted, but because he's of Jewish ancestry, he will be in all sorts of problems, as you would expect. So he spends as much time as he can in Paris, and then he has to leave, and he joins the Italian resistance. He flees into the mountains, and he's put in charge of cultural events in a refugee camp. And it's there that he meets some people who are interested in theatre, and there he begins to get interested in directing theatre.
And he starts to make connections with his interest in anthropology.
Yeah, he starts to make connections. And once the war is over, he is by this time a member of the Italian Communist Party. He's asked to stay on in the region that he's in. And he starts to gain a reputation for directing theatre. And he presents himself as a Polish theatre director. And he starts to direct theatre. The offers become increasingly important, and he is doing very well as a theatre director. He's not trained. He's learned everything in the studio on the job. And he reaches a point in the 1950s where he's saying, okay, this is good, but it's not really enough. There's something missing in creating, directing plays every season.
Yeah. And it's interesting, you say the 1950s, because there were things happening to change theater in the United States around that time, too.
Absolutely. So Richard Schechner's about to start. The Living Theatre, who is going to eventually visit him, are about to start. So all of this is popping up. Very importantly, the thesis by Antonin Artaud, The Theatre and Its Double, is translated from French into every other Western language. And so everybody's beginning to pick up on Artaud's ideas about ritual and theatre. So in 1957, Alessandro is on a tour to South America with a theatre company that he's running. And during the tour, he's interested in samba music. So he meets a composer of samba, and he talks about his interest in anthropology. And the samba composer says, look, if you would like to, you should come and see a candomblé ritual. And the candomblé are the descendants of Yoruban peoples who were enslaved, brought to South America, but because they were kept together as families, were able to retain their culture. So he is invited.
It's a transplanted culture
it's
from
a transplanted culture that is also a culture that is heavily organized around possession trance states. So, and it's
I'm sorry, around
possession trance. So
Okay.
the gods come from Africa and the Orishas, the gods come from Africa, and the celebrants are possessed by the gods and dance. And it's an all-female cult. And so Alessandro has to dress in ritual female garb, and he's invited to witness one of these ceremonies. And he witnesses a couple of them, gets very excited by it all, sees the power of it. The company goes back to Italy. He gets permission to stay for 6 months. And for 6 months, he witnesses, talks to members of the cult, and sees what happens with the power of ritual performance, the power that is unleashed. He comes back when at the end of his stay to Italy and says, there's something in ritual performance that I want to explore. It goes beyond ordinary acting. It's not the idea of the actor interpreting a script. This is the idea of an actor creating a moment, an event, within a state of momentary trance. And so he wants to do this. And so he's still got his day job of director, but he is more and more interested, but the Italian authorities will not allow him simply to set up what they considered to be a subversive commune. He has to establish a theatre school in order to do this. So he establishes, at the end of the 1950s, he establishes the first independent theatre training program in Italy.
So this is interesting. So it's not a movement that then results in the creation of a school. It's actually a school that's about to create a movement, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so it's a 2-year program, which any of your theatre students would know. They're studying the traditions of Western theatre, so Shakespeare, Stanislavski. They're studying acting, voice, etc. But at the end of the 2 to 4 years there's an additional year in which they study with him, and they start to explore ideas of how does a Western actor achieve a momentary state of trance and what happens in that trance state. And from 1957 through till the 1990s when I met him, he's regularly experimenting with these things.
Now, does he separate trance from possession? Does he see possession as just a...
He sees it as 2 different things.
Yes.
First of all, and he is, while he's doing this work, he has anthropologists working with him. So they're advising him on exactly what's happening in his studio. There are 2 different basic forms of trance. One is shamanistic trance, where the shaman flies out to meet the spirit. And there's possession trance, where the idea is that the spirit comes to the terms of the Yoruba, the candomblé. It's assumed that the spirit is coming from Africa to inhabit the person. So he's looking at both of these. And what he understands is that the trance he witnessed in South America and Brazil was actually created by manipulating objects, and the continual manipulation of objects, manipulating until a rhythm builds up, and the participant enters enters a state of trance. And so he starts to experiment. Well, what happens if we're in a position like this? I've got a cup and I start manipulating that cup, and does it start to take on another idea, or does it spring an idea into my mind, a memory into my mind that comes from somewhere deep inside me?
So so it sounds like he's seeing this strictly from a scientific, psychological, physiological perspective. He's not saying that these people are actually possessed.
Well, he is saying that there is a moment when they lose consciousness of what they're doing.
Yeah.
And they are dancing, and most possession cults, they resolves itself in dance. And they are dancing to a point where they collapse. And what's important is, according to the cult that he was studying, as the person is possessed, their consciousness leaves them, their persona leaves them, and they're inhabited by the god. They dance until they reach a state of collapse when the god or the spirit leaves, and the people witnessing then fill in what has happened.
So if an actor
Yeah.
then...
An actor can, in normal acting and interpretation, we know from scientific elements that an actor can get so involved in their part that
Sure.
momentarily they lose consciousness
Right.
of the audience, possibly even of the other person on stage.
And they have
But
an
it's a
intuitive
momentary thing.
understanding of the part that takes over,
Yeah.
essentially, right?
Yeah, there's a lovely story of Sir Laurence Olivier doing a magnificent performance one night of Shylock in the Merchant of Venice in London. And afterwards, people rush backstage to say, Sir Laurence, you were wonderful. And they find him crying. And he said, I know I did something tonight, but I can't tell you what I did. But it was totally different, and I can't remember what I did, and I doubt whether I can do it again. But there was this one moment when everything was alive and exciting, and I was that character. I understood Shylock perfectly.
So this is something that may have been a factor in theater
Yeah,
for years and years,
and
right?
this
It
is
just
what-
hasn't been named.
Right, this is what Fersen does. He looks back, he said, this is the origins of theatre. And what through his experiments, he arrives at a technique which he calls Mnemodrama, Mnemodrama, a drama of memory.
Of memory.
And he looks at memory from an anthropological perspective in two ways. He said that there's a daily memory, daily activities which we store up, and we remember what happened last week, last year, etc. But there's a vertical memory, which is deep down inside us, which is a cultural memory. And his thesis, born out of studying anthropology, is that in times of crisis, and we might call acting a kind of hyper-reality, a type of crisis in many ways.
Yeah, definitely.
That at times of crisis, we burrow down deeply into our cultural memories. And sometimes those memories are family memories of our ancestors, but at other times they're deep cultural memories that suddenly come to the surface. And they come to the surface almost unbidden. And his analogy is, again, a piece of Shakespeare. He says, if we look at Lady Macbeth in her final scene, what's she doing? She has killed people. She's responsible for killing Duncan. Macbeth's castle is surrounded. She is in a room. She's wringing her hands, and she is muttering about the blood. Out damn Spot. How do we know we have so much blood in him? And Fersen says that is a precise example for him of a Western idea of memodrama. Suddenly this memory of her killing becomes violently apparent. She's wringing her hands. She's seeing in her hands the blood of the dead King Duncan, which of course is not there. And she's being watched by a doctor and a nurse, and she is pacing and wringing her hands. Yeah. And that for him is the vertical memory suddenly tearing back into the present. And that's what he says memodrama is. It's the rediscovery or the re-evocation of a memory in the present time.
Which then takes the acting and the performance to another level.
It takes it to another level. And what he discovered was that what can be done in the studio, that people could get into momentary states of trance in the studio, and it is fleeting.
Yeah.
It's a few minutes, at the end of which they are exhausted, but it could not be replicated. So he tried at one point to say, okay, I'm seeing these trance states. And what happens in the trance states? Eyelids flicker, there's sometimes grunting speech. There's a lot of very sensuous dancing. The body becomes very free. And then there's a momentary state of collapse.
I can see how some directors would find this problematic.
Totally problematic. He found it problematic because what he found was you cannot reproduce this.
Yeah,
you cannot
yes.
apply this to a text. We can't say, all right, we're going to do Macbeth and have this have this Mnemodrama. So what he does is to say, okay, we cannot apply this to the theatre that exists in the West. We cannot apply this to dramatic theatre, where the actor is the interpreter of the playwright. What we can do, however, is use this as a training mechanism to discover, if you like, a spiritual essence inside of us, without becoming denominational. That we can discover a deeper essence within the human being. And maybe this has a community benefit. So he starts to, along with other people, take theatre out of our tradition of a theatre where there is an actor and a spectator, and says, let's take theatre into an immersive experience where the difference between actor and spectator is completely diluted and taken away, because the people watching would also be people who were studying training.
This is another profound change in traditional theater here.
And we can see, I think, that, and we're in obviously a very interesting time here, because we're all asking ourselves, what is theater going to be like post-COVID? And what we're realizing, even pre-COVID, is that what is exciting for many people, particularly the younger generation, my students, is that they want an immersive experience. They don't want to be, in a sense, confined to, there's a performance going on there and I'm sitting here as a spectator, or I'm on stage and I'm playing to spectators. What if we allied this and we have an immersive experience?
It's an interesting analogy with COVID, because I'm teaching online and you're using Zoom, and everybody's just got a little picture on the screen, and the professor is just one of those pictures, and it's a much more immersive experience. And I feel much more connected to the students, and I think they're more tuned into what's going on as a result of that.
Yeah, and I think when we come through COVID, when it's contained, we're going to find in performance that we have become so used to this that, yes, of course, the traditional form of theatre will come back in some form, but it's going to shift, I think, more to communal experiences, immersive experiences.
Now, you're not talking about theater in the round, obviously, so what's an example of what he had in mind when he said a communal experience?
That everybody in the room is participating in the training. And this training takes years, so it's not something where you can do a weekend of training and say, okay, I've got Mnemodrama. This takes a long time. But he would say that people are using theatre techniques, using theatre training to discover something richer about themselves. So there's a therapeutic element to it, but he was very cautious about being aligned with therapeutic practices. Early in his experiments, therapists were grabbing hold of him and saying, look, can I train in this because I can use this with my patients? And he would say, absolutely not, because this is a theatre technique. It's not, it's therapeutic for theatre practitioners, for actors, ostensibly.
It's interesting, though, that there were so many things going on like this at that time, the primal scream therapy. And,
So and as I said earlier, he is part of that. The interesting thing, Grotowski comes to visit him, Peter Brook comes to visit him, etc., as I said earlier. But he doesn't veer away from this. They go off and do other things. He keeps plowing this furrow and seeing how far he can go with Mnemodrama. And his books are not translated. So to a certain extent, he has been a footnote to what was happening, as you say, in the 60s. But I think now we're at a point in the 21st century where many of those ideas are being rediscovered because of what, not only because of what we're going through with COVID, but because I think with that genuine desire to celebrate community and to celebrate diversity within community. And he was very clear that what he didn't want in his practice was what we would call cultural tourism. He was against going to India, seeing some things, trying to bring that back and say, okay, we're going to reproduce this here. Right. He was very much about, we are Western theater practitioners, let's see what we discover in the theater and adhere to that.
And tap into our own
origins. Tap into our own origins, yeah.
That's all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Green for joining me today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.